The storm had already swallowed the horizon when the estate of Blackthorne Hall came alive with the sound of hoofs striking wet stone. Lightning split the sky in two, and in that brief, blinding flash the Duke's fiercest horse, Midnight Rain, reared violently inside the marble courtyard. Men scattered, stable boys screamed, no one dared step close. Because Midnight Rain was not an ordinary horse. He had broken 3 trainers' ribs, bitten through iron reins, and once thrown a cavalry captain into a stone fountain during a royal inspection. Even the Duke himself had not mounted him in months, and yet tonight the beast was restless in a way that felt almost intelligent, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. Inside the grand estate, chandeliers trembled with each thunderstrike. Noble guests whispered behind silk fans, gathered for what was supposed to be a quiet aristocratic visit to the Duke of Blackthorne. Duke of Blackthorne, a man known for 2 things, his wealth, and his complete lack of mercy. No woman had ever been invited into his inner circle twice. No servant had ever lasted more than a month. And yet, tonight, among the unseen staff moving like shadows through velvet corridors, there was her, a maid. No one knew her name properly. No one asked. She was simply the quiet one, the girl who never spoke unless spoken to, the girl who kept her eyes lowered as if the world itself was too heavy to look at. But the storm outside seemed to recognize her presence, because the moment she stepped into the courtyard holding a lantern, everything changed. Midnight Rain stopped, completely. The horse that had been tearing at iron chains seconds ago suddenly froze as if time itself had grabbed his throat. Every guard turned. "Don't go near him," one shouted. "He'll kill her." But she did not stop, she did not hesitate. The maid simply walked forward, lantern swaying gently in her hand, rain slipping through her bonnet and tracing her cheeks like silver tears. Step. Step. The ground trembled under the horse's hooves. Midnight Rain lowered his head slightly, not in aggression, but recognition. Inside the manor balcony above, hidden behind velvet curtains, the Duke watched. His gloved hand tightened around the railing. "What is she doing?" he murmured, voice cold as winter steel. No one answered him, because no one understood what they were seeing. The maid finally stopped a few feet from the beast. Now everyone expected it. The snap, the charge, the tragedy. Midnight Rain exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, and then he bowed. Not violently, not forcefully, but slowly, as if kneeling before royalty. Gasps erupted across the courtyard. A stable master dropped his lantern. One of the guards crossed himself. The Duke stepped forward from the balcony so quickly his coat almost tore against the doorframe. "That's impossible," he said under his breath. The maid reached out her hand. No gloves, no fear, just skin meeting storm air. And then, against every law of nature, training, and aristocratic understanding, the horse leaned into her palm, like a creature finally coming home. A whisper escaped her lips. Not a command. Not a spell. Just a word so soft the wind almost stole it. "Easy," and Midnight Rain closed his eyes. The beast that had not known peace in years stilled completely. Inside the Duke's chest, something unfamiliar shifted. Not anger, not amusement, something sharper, something dangerous. Curiosity. He descended the grand staircase immediately, boots striking marble with growing urgency. Servants scrambled out of his way. "Bring her to me," he ordered sharply. But when he reached the courtyard, she was gone. Only the horse remained, calm now, breathing evenly, as if nothing had ever been wrong. The Duke grabbed the stable master by the collar. "Where is she?" The man trembled. "My lord, she's just a maid. She returned to the West Wing. She always returns there. No one follows her." No one. The Duke released him, and stared into the rain. Because for the first time in years, something in his estate had acted without his permission. And it had obeyed her, later that night. In the servants' corridor, candles flickered low and uncertain. The maid walked alone, water dripping from her sleeves onto stone floors. But she was not alone. She felt it, that gaze. Heavy, unrelenting, from somewhere above her, watching, waiting. And when she finally stopped walking, a voice cut through the darkness behind her. Cold, controlled, dangerously calm. "You are not what you appear to be." She turned slowly, and there he stood. The Duke of Blackthorne. Close enough now that she could see the storm reflected in his eyes. "I asked a question," he said quietly, "and I expect answers." Lowered her gaze. "I am only a servant, my lord." A silence stretched between them. Then the Duke stepped closer, too close. "Lies," he said softly, and somewhere far outside the manor, Midnight Rain screamed, as if warning them both. That what had just begun could not be controlled, not by rank, not by power, not by blood. The maid finally looked up, and the candle between them flickered violently, as if afraid of what it might reveal. And then The Duke spoke again, slower this time. "What did you do to my horse?" Her lips parted slightly, but before she could answer, footsteps echoed down the corridor behind him, and someone else arrived. A voice from the shadows said, "My Duke, you should not be alone with her." The maid's eyes widened ever so slightly, because that voice knew her, and the Duke had just stepped into something far larger than he understood. The corridor fell into a silence so sharp it felt carved out of stone. The Duke did not turn immediately. He already knew that voice. That was the worst part, because voices like that did not belong to ordinary servants. They belonged to men who had been promoted beyond their place, and punished by knowledge. Slowly the Duke of Blackthorne turned his head. Behind him stood a man dressed in a steward's coat, dark green, perfectly pressed, too clean for someone who lived among servants. His posture was rigid, but his eyes were not. They were alert, measuring, dangerous in a different way. "Master Caldwell," the Duke said coldly, "you are interrupting me." Caldwell bowed slightly, but it was not respect, it was warning disguised as manners. "My Duke," Caldwell replied, "I am preventing you from making a mistake that cannot be undone." The maid stood between them like a shadow caught in candlelight, still, silent, watching, and for the first time, uncertain, because Caldwell was looking at her not like a servant, but like someone who had seen her before she ever arrived at Blackthorne Hall. The Duke stepped closer to Caldwell. "You presume too much." Caldwell did not flinch. "I presume nothing," he said. "I remember." A pause. Even the candle flame seemed to hesitate. The Duke's voice lowered. "Remember what?" Caldwell's gaze shifted, just briefly, to the maid. And something unspoken passed between them. A history. A fracture. A truth buried too deep to surface cleanly. Then Caldwell said it. "Evelyn Ashbourne." The name hit the corridor like a struck bell. The maid's fingers tightened ever so slightly at her side. Not fear. Recognition. The Duke noticed. His eyes sharpened immediately. "So she does have a name," he said slowly, turning to her now fully. The maid, Evelyn, lowered her gaze again, but it was too late. The mask had cracked, and Caldwell had seen it happen. Outside thunder rolled again, louder this time, closer, as if the estate itself was listening. The Duke stepped between them slightly, as though physically blocking Caldwell's claim on the moment. "Explain," the Duke ordered. "Now," Caldwell inhaled carefully. "My Duke, she is not a normal maid." The Duke's lips tightened. "None of my servants are normal," he said. "They are either useful or dismissed." Caldwell shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "You misunderstand. She is not part of your household by accident." The Duke turned sharply. "What does that mean?" Caldwell hesitated, and that hesitation said more than words ever could. Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was soft, controlled, but there was something beneath it. Something restrained. "I should not be here," she said. The Duke looked at her fully now. For the first time, really looked. Not as a servant. Not as an object of curiosity, but as a presence. And something in him resisted the idea of letting her become anything else. "Yet you are," he said, a beat. Then he added quieter, "And my horse bowed to you." At the mention of the horse, Caldwell visibly stiffened. Evelyn's eyes flickered. Just once. Enough. The Duke caught it. "Explain that," he said sharply. Caldwell stepped forward slightly. "That horse," he said carefully, "is not merely a horse." The Duke exhaled through his nose. "I am aware he is difficult." "No," Caldwell interrupted, firmer now. "You are not." Silence. Even the candles seemed to dim in response. Caldwell continued. "Midnight Rain was bred for obedience to violence. Every generation of that bloodline was trained to respond only to dominance, fear, force, control." The Duke's jaw tightened. "I trained him myself." Caldwell shook his head. "And yet he never truly obeyed you, did he?" That landed. The Duke did not respond immediately, because it was true. Midnight Rain obeyed no one. Not ever, except tonight, except her. Evelyn took a slow step backward. "I did not command him," she said softly. "I never do." Caldwell's voice dropped. "That is precisely the problem." The Duke turned to her again. "What are you?" The question was not cruel, it was worse, it was direct. Evelyn hesitated, and in that hesitation something deeper stirred behind her eyes. Memories she did not invite, a past she did not wear like clothing. "I was born near the eastern marshes," she said finally, "where animals are not trained, they are spoken to." Caldwell's expression tightened. The Duke narrowed his eyes. "That is nonsense." But Evelyn did not react. She simply continued. "My mother used to say some creatures are not broken into obedience, because they were never meant to be controlled." The corridor grew colder. The Duke stepped closer. "Your mother," he said. "Was she also a maid?" Evelyn's silence answered before her words did. "No." That single word changed everything. Caldwell exhaled sharply. "You should not have brought her here," he said to the Duke. The Duke turned on him instantly. "I bring whoever I wish into my household." Caldwell's voice sharpened. "Not her." A tense beat. Then the Duke asked, slower now. "Why?" Caldwell looked at Evelyn again, and this time there was something like regret in his expression. "Because people like her do not belong inside estates like this." Evelyn finally lifted her eyes, and when she did, the candlelight flickered again. Not randomly, not naturally. It bent. Just slightly, as if the flame itself leaned toward her attention. The Duke noticed immediately. So did Caldwell. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Then far down the corridor, boots echoed, fast, urgent. A guard appeared at the end of the hall, breathless. "My Duke!" he called out. "The horse, Midnight Rain. He's broken free from the stables again." The Duke's eyes sharpened instantly. "What?" The guard shook his head, terrified. "He's not attacking anyone. He's just standing outside the west wing. He won't move." The Duke turned slowly, toward Evelyn. So did Caldwell. A realization forming between them like a tightening rope. Evelyn whispered almost to herself. "No," but it was too late. The Duke's voice was quiet. "Is he waiting for you?" Caldwell stepped forward quickly. "My Duke, do not let her go outside." But the Duke raised a hand, and silence returned instantly. Because authority like his did not need volume, it needed presence. He looked at Evelyn. "Come with me," he said. It was not a request, but it was not cruelty either. It was curiosity sharpened into command. Evelyn shook her head slightly. "I should not. You already are," the Duke interrupted. A pause. Then softer. "And he is calling for you." That word, calling, shifted something in the air. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, something had changed. Not her expression. Something deeper. She nodded once. "I will go," she said quietly. Caldwell immediately stepped forward. "That is a mistake." The Duke glanced at him. "Then stop her." Caldwell froze, because he could not, and they all knew it. Evelyn moved past them, slow, careful, like someone walking toward a memory she had buried alive. The Duke followed. Caldwell hesitated, then followed too. Outside, the storm had not lessened, it had gathered. The courtyard doors opened slowly, and there he was, Midnight Rain, standing perfectly still. Rain sliding down his black coat like ink over marble. His head turned the moment Evelyn appeared, and for the first time in recorded history inside Blackthorne Hall, the beast took a step back. Not in fear, but in reverence. Evelyn stepped forward. One step into the rain. The Duke watched carefully. Caldwell whispered, almost broken, "It's worse than I thought." The Duke didn't look away. "Explain." Caldwell swallowed. "She doesn't just calm him." A pause. "She belongs to the same origin." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "What origin?" Caldwell finally said it. "The bloodline of the Whisperers." Thunder cracked so violently it felt like the sky itself had heard the name and reacted. Evelyn stopped walking. Midnight Rain lowered his head again, slowly, like before, but this time it was not submission, it was recognition, and then Evelyn reached out and placed her hand on his forehead. The horse closed his eyes instantly, as if exhaling after years of holding breath. The Duke stepped forward slightly, something inside him shifting, something he did not have a name for yet, but Caldwell grabbed his sleeve. "Do not interrupt this." The Duke looked at him sharply. "Or what?" Caldwell's voice dropped to something almost like fear. "Or you will learn why her kind was never meant to be found again." Evelyn whispered something to the horse, too soft to hear, but the effect was immediate. Midnight Rain bowed fully. Not just the head. The front leg bent. A complete kneel. The kind of submission no noble, no king, no trainer had ever achieved, and in that moment, Evelyn turned her head slightly toward the Duke, and said, "He remembers me." The Duke's breath slowed. From where? Evelyn hesitated, rain dripping from her lashes, and then, far beyond the estate walls, something howled in the distance. Not animal, not human, something older. And Evelyn's eyes darkened slightly as she whispered, "From before I was a maid." The Duke stepped forward, but Caldwell suddenly shouted, "Stop, don't let her say more." And at that exact moment, Midnight Rain lifted his head sharply, and every lantern in the courtyard went out at once. Total darkness. Only Evelyn's voice remained, soft, calm, and no longer alone, because something else had answered her. And the Duke realized, too late, that the thing he thought he had discovered tonight had already been looking for him long before he ever saw her. The darkness did not feel empty. It felt occupied, as if the air itself had learned how to breathe without light. The Duke stood completely still, one hand half raised from instinct rather than intention. Around him the storm continued to rage, but it sounded distant now, muted, like it was happening behind thick glass, and in that unnatural silence Evelyn's voice remained, not louder, not sharper, just closer than it should have been. You should not have followed me here, she said. The Duke narrowed his eyes into the darkness. I did not follow you, he replied evenly. I followed my horse. A pause. Then very faintly she answered, Liar, the word was not an insult, it was an observation, and somehow that made it worse. Caldwell stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching lightly on wet stone. My Duke, he whispered urgently, we must return inside, now. But the Duke did not move, because Midnight Rain had not moved either, and that was what disturbed him most. The horse that had once shattered iron gates and broken men's bones was now still, completely still, as if listening, as if waiting for permission to exist. Then a sound, not a hoof, not a wind, a breath, too close to Evelyn. The Duke's eyes sharpened instantly. Step away from the horse, he ordered sharply into the dark. Silence. Then Evelyn replied, almost gently. He will not harm me. Caldwell's voice broke slightly. That is not what I am afraid of. Another pause. Then Midnight Rain exhaled, and the lanterns around the courtyard reignited all at once, not slowly, not naturally, instantly, like reality had been forced to obey. And in that sudden light, everything changed again. Evelyn was no longer standing where she had been. She was closer to Midnight Rain, too close. Her hand resting on his chest, and the horse was lowering himself further, as if surrendering not just strength, but identity. The Duke stepped forward. Enough, he said sharply. Step away from him. Evelyn did not look at him. I am not controlling him, she said quietly. I am stabilizing him. Caldwell's face went pale. That word, he whispered. No, the Duke turned instantly. What word? Caldwell hesitated, then said carefully, stabilizing. A cold tension spread through the courtyard. Even the rain seemed to slow. The Duke's voice lowered. Explain. Caldwell looked at Evelyn as if she were standing at the edge of something catastrophic. The Whisperers, he said quietly, were not trainers. They were not riders, they were regulators. Evelyn finally looked up, and the Duke saw it, a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, not pride. Memory, Caldwell continued, voice tightening. They did not break animals, they balanced them. When a creature's instincts became too violent, too unstable, the Whisperers would reset them. The Duke frowned. That is impossible, Caldwell shook his head. It is extinct. A pause, then, or it was supposed to be. The Duke looked at Evelyn again. Is this true? Evelyn hesitated, then nodded once. Yes. That single word felt heavier than thunder. Caldwell stepped back slightly, shaking his head. This cannot be happening again. The Duke's gaze sharpened. What exactly are you afraid of? Caldwell swallowed. The last time a Whisperer bonded with a war-bred beast like this, he said slowly. The animal did not remain an animal. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Midnight Rain lifted his head slightly at that. Evelyn's hand remained on him, steady, calm, but her voice dropped. That is not what happened, she said. Caldwell flinched. The Duke stepped closer. What did happen? He demanded. Evelyn finally turned fully toward him, and for the first time there was something like strain in her expression. I saved him, she said. A pause. Then she added, when he was still human. The Duke froze. Caldwell whispered, No! But Evelyn continued. They called him a failed experiment. A noble-born child trained for emotional suppression, war conditioning, and obedience refinement. They pushed him too far. Her hand tightened slightly on Midnight Rain's chest, and when his mind fractured, I was brought in to stabilize him. The Duke's expression hardened. You are telling me my horse. But Evelyn cut him off. He is not your horse. Silence. That landed harder than anything else. Even Caldwell didn't speak. Evelyn continued softly. He never was. Midnight Rain shifted slightly at her touch. Not violently, not confused, just aware, as if something inside him was responding to language buried deep beneath instinct. The Duke stepped forward slowly. Then what is he? Evelyn hesitated, and for the first time she looked uncertain. Something that should not exist anymore. The wind shifted violently, the courtyard gates creaked open on their own, and from beyond them came footsteps, slow, measured, too organized to be natural. Caldwell's eyes widened immediately. No, 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 the Duke turned sharply. What is it now? Caldwell's voice dropped to a whisper. They found her. Evelyn's expression changed instantly. For the first time since this began, she looked afraid. Midnight Rain lifted his head sharply. And then a voice called from outside the gates, calm, formal, and so she is here. 3 figures emerged through the storm, all dressed in black coats marked with a crest the Duke did not recognize. But Caldwell did, his face drained of colour completely. The order, he whispered. The Duke stepped forward slightly. Identify yourselves. The man in the centre smiled faintly. I am Overseer Rellan, he said. and we are here to retrieve a property that has escaped containment. Evelyn's grip on Midnight Rain tightened. I am not property, she said coldly. Rellan tilted his head. That is what you believe, he replied gently. But belief does not alter classification. The Duke stepped forward immediately. This is my estate. You will leave. Rellan's gaze shifted to him. And you are? The Duke of Blackthorne, a pause. Then Rellan smiled slightly. Oh, he said softly, we did not expect you to still be alive. The Duke's eyes sharpened dangerously. Caldwell moved closer to him quickly. My Duke, they are not had here for discussion. Rellan raised a hand slightly. Behind him, more figures emerged from the rain, too many, too organised. The courtyard filled slowly with silent presence. Then Rellan spoke again. Evelyn Ashbourne will return with us. Evelyn stepped forward instantly. No. Rellan's gaze softened. It is not a request. Midnight Rains suddenly stepped forward between Evelyn and the men. A low sound rumbled from his chest, not a horse's warning, something deeper. Rellan studied him. Oh, he murmured. He's still responsive. Then he looked at Evelyn again. You stabilized him too well. Evelyn's voice sharpened. I saved him. Rellan nodded slightly. And now he remembers enough to become dangerous again. The Duke stepped closer. No one is taking her. Rellan finally looked at him fully, and smiled again. Your attachment is noted, he said calmly, but irrelevant. Then he raised his hand, and everything stopped. The wind, the rain, even Midnight Rain, frozen. Evelyn gasped softly. Stop! Rellan stepped forward into the stillness. You were never meant to stay hidden, he said to her. The experiment continues. The Duke tried to move, but his body would not respond. Caldwell's eyes widened in horror. It's field suppression, he whispered. They've activated a containment lattice. Rellan reached toward Evelyn. Come with us, Whisperer. Evelyn trembled. Midnight Rain's eyes flickered, and in that moment something inside the Duke snapped. Not physically, not violently, but internally, like something refusing to be irrelevant. And against the impossible force holding him, he moved, one step, then another. Rellan turned slightly, surprised. Interesting, he murmured. The Duke's voice came out strained but steady. Release her. Rellan tilted his head. You are resisting suppression architecture, he said. That should not be possible. The Duke took another step. Release. Evelyn looked at him, truly looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Rellan sighed. Very well, he said softly. Then he turned to his men. Adjust the field. Increase pressure. The air shattered, and the Duke fell to one knee instantly. Caldwell collapsed beside him. Evelyn cried out. Midnight Rain broke free for half a second, then froze again. Rellan walked toward Evelyn slowly. It is time, he said gently, and as his hand reached her, Evelyn whispered something under her breath, too soft for anyone to hear, except Midnight Rain. His eyes snapped open, and for the first time he spoke, not in words, but in a sound that bent the air itself, and the suppression field cracked. Rellan froze. What did you do? He whispered. Evelyn looked up slowly and said, I stopped obeying you. The courtyard lights exploded outward, and everything began to break, reality itself starting to slip. The moment Evelyn spoke those words, I stopped obeying you, the world did not simply react, it fractured, not like glass, like something alive being forced to remember it had bones. The suppression field that had pinned the Duke, Caldwell, Midnight Rain, and even the rain itself began to stutter violently. The air flickered in and out of existence in thin, unstable layers, like reality couldn't decide which version of the moment was correct. Rellan took a slow step back. For the first time his expression shifted. Not fear, recognition, that voice signature, he muttered. Impossible. Evelyn stood still in the centre of it all. Her hair, soaked by rain moments ago, now floated slightly around her face as if gravity had become negotiable in her presence. Midnight Rain moved again, slowly, deliberately, one hoof forward. Then another. Each step produced no sound. Not because it was silent, but because sound itself was hesitating to form. The Duke struggled to rise. His muscles felt like they were wrapped in iron chains, but something inside him, stubborn, untrained, purely human, kept pushing. Caldwell coughed violently beside him. They've destabilized the containment lattice, he choked out. If it collapses fully, Blackthorne Estate will be erased from mapped continuity. The Duke turned sharply despite the strain. Erased? Caldwell nodded grimly. They are not just men, my Duke. They are custodians of erased sciences. If they lose control of this level of anomaly, a sudden pulse cut him off. The courtyard bent inward, and Rellan raised his hand again, sharper this time. Enough, he said coldly. This ends now. Behind him, the other operatives stepped forward in perfect synchronization. Their boots hit the ground in unison, and the world responded. The air snapped back into rigidity. Evelyn winced. Midnight Rain halted mid-step. The Duke dropped back to one knee again, teeth clenched. Rellen's voice hardened. You are a stabilized anomaly, Evelyn Ashbourne. You are not a free entity. You are not a myth reborn. You are a controlled interface between instinct and correction. Evelyn shook her head slowly. No, she whispered. Rellen stepped closer. Yes, then he gestured toward Midnight Rain. And that thing behind you is the consequence of your failure. The horse reacted instantly. A deep, distorted sound rolled through the courtyard. Not a roar, not a neigh, but something between memory and pain. Evelyn turned sharply. Don't call him that. Rellen smiled faintly. You still protect him, even now. The Duke forced himself upright again, shaking. His voice came out low. Stop speaking as if she belongs to you. Rellen didn't even look at him. You are still prioritizing irrelevant variables, he said dismissively. Nobility, ownership, emotion, all decorative constructs. And he finally turned to the Duke. And you are especially interesting. The Duke's jaw tightened. I don't care. Rellen tilted his head. That is why you are still conscious. A pause. Then Rellen added, Most nobles break when the suppression field is introduced. You are resisting it. Caldwell coughed again. He's not normal, he whispered hoarsely. He never was. Rellen ignored him. Instead, his gaze sharpened on the Duke. You have exposure. The Duke narrowed his eyes. Exposure to what? Rellen took a step closer. To her kind. Evelyn stiffened slightly. Rellen continued. The Whisperers do not simply stabilize creatures. They imprint resonance, emotional alignment, neural symmetry correction. The Duke's expression darkened. I don't understand your words. Rellen nodded. Of course you don't. You were not meant to. Then he lifted his hand slightly, and a thin circular device unfolded from his wrist like a mechanical flower. It pulsed, once, and Midnight Rain screamed, not in sound, in presence. The entire courtyard warped. Evelyn dropped to her knees instantly, clutching her head. No, stop! The Duke moved toward her, but Rellen gestured again, and he froze mid-step, locked in place by invisible force. Rellen's voice was almost gentle. Let us correct the instability at its source. Evelyn looked up sharply. What are you doing to him? Rellen replied calmly, removing residual imprinting. Midnight Rain's body trembled violently now, as if something inside him was being pulled apart thread by thread. Evelyn's voice broke. You'll kill him. Rellen shook his head. No, we will return him to baseline structure. The Duke strained against the field. What does that mean? He shouted. Rellen finally looked at him again. It means he will forget her. Silence. That word landed differently. Not like pain, like loss before it even happened. Evelyn stood slowly, shaking. You can't erase him, she said quietly. Rellen's eyes narrowed slightly. We already did once. Evelyn froze. The Duke turned sharply toward her. Once? Rellen nodded. Before your interference. He looked at Midnight Rain. Before she broke protocol and bonded instead of correcting. Evelyn whispered. I didn't break anything. Rellen's voice sharpened. You deviated. The suppression field pulsed harder. Midnight Rain's body began to glow faintly beneath his coat, lines of unnatural light appearing under his skin like mapped circuits waking up. The Duke's eyes widened slightly. What is that? Caldwell whispered in terror. It's not a horse. Rellen stepped closer. It never was. Evelyn suddenly stood fully. And something changed in her posture, not confidence, not anger, clarity. She looked at Midnight Rain and spoke softly. Kael. The name hit the air like a key turning in a lock. The Duke stiffened. Rellen reacted instantly. No, don't activate recognition layering. Too late. Midnight Rain stopped screaming. The glowing lines beneath his coat stabilized. And then he looked at Evelyn, directly, fully aware, not animal, not beast, something else entirely. Rellen's voice dropped dangerously. You should not have done that. Evelyn didn't look at him. He remembers, she said softly. The Duke's voice broke slightly. What did you just call him? Evelyn hesitated, then answered. His name. A pause. Then she added. Before they turned him into Midnight Rain, the courtyard fell into a deeper silence than before. Even the suppression field flickered. Rellen's expression darkened. This is now critical failure, he muttered. Then he raised both hands. All units, prepare full reclamation sequence. The operatives behind him moved instantly. Caldwell shouted. My Duke! He's going to extract her forcefully. The Duke's body trembled with effort. But this time, he refused to stop pushing. Blood ran from his palm where his nails dug in. And still he moved forward. Step, by Fasten noticed, and frowned slightly. You are persistent. The Duke's voice was low. I said, release her. Rellen sighed. Very well. He raised his hand, and everything went white. Not light, not explosion, erasure. The world vanished for half a heartbeat, and when it returned, Evelyn was gone. Silence hit the courtyard like a collapsed tower. Midnight Rain stood alone. The Duke froze. Caldwell whispered, "No!" Rellan lowered his hand slowly. "Containment successful," he said. The Duke turned slowly. Something inside him had stopped being restrained. "Where is she?" Rellan adjusted his wrist device. Relocated to secure extraction vessel, the Duke stepped forward, each step heavier now. Rellan met his gaze calmly. "And I will answer the same way." A pause. "Then you cannot reach her?" A beat. The Duke's voice dropped into something dangerous. "Watch me." And somewhere far beyond the estate, Evelyn opened her eyes inside a moving containment carriage carved from black glass and metal, and she whispered to herself, "No, not yet," because Midnight Rain was still out there, and the Duke was not finished resisting the world, not even close. The Blackthorne courtyard did not settle after Evelyn vanished. It recoiled, as if the estate itself had just lost something it could not name, and now did not know how to behave without it. The suppression field flickered once more, then collapsed entirely. Silence returned, but it was unstable silence, like a room after a scream. Midnight Rain stood alone in the rain, still, but no longer calm. The Duke turned slowly toward Rellan. No words at first, only breath, measured, controlled, too controlled. Caldwell, kneeling behind him, whispered weakly, "My Duke, don't!" But the Duke lifted his hand slightly, and Caldwell stopped speaking immediately. Rellan watched him with mild curiosity. "You are still standing," Rellan observed. "Interesting." The Duke took one step forward, then another. The rain hit his shoulders harder now, as if the sky had decided he was the only remaining target. "Bring her back," the Duke said. Rellan tilted his head. "That is not how retrieval works." The Duke's voice lowered. "I did not ask how it works." A pause. Then Rellan sighed as if dealing with something tedious. "You are emotionally compromised," he said. "This is predictable." The Duke stopped walking. For the first time, his expression changed slightly. Not anger, something colder. "I am not compromised," he said quietly. "I am deciding." Rellan's eyes narrowed. "Deciding what?" The Duke looked past him, at the species where Evelyn had been taken. And then, very calmly, he said, "To break whatever system believes it owns her." A faint silence followed. Even the operatives behind Rellan shifted slightly at that. Rellan exhaled. "You are a noble," he said, "not a variable in this architecture." The Duke stepped forward again. "I am not asking for permission to matter." That landed differently. Caldwell looked up sharply. Midnight Rain moved slightly behind them. One hoof scraped stone. Rellan raised his hand again. "But this time slower, then you will be removed as interference." The air tightened. The courtyard responded instantly. Invisible pressure returned, but weaker than before, because something had changed. The Duke was no longer resisting as a man. He was resisting as something else. Rellan noticed immediately. "That imprinting didn't fade," he murmured. The Duke's jaw tightened. "Imprinting?" Rellan studied him carefully now. "You were exposed to whisperer resonance during prolonged proximity," he said. "That should have been impossible." Caldwell whispered hoarsely, "My Duke, please listen to me." But the Duke didn't move his gaze. "Explain what you did to her." Rellan hesitated, then answered, "We refined her." The Duke's expression hardened. "That is not an answer." Rellan continued anyway. "Whisperers are not individuals, they are interfaces. Their function is to stabilize unstable biological systems that exceed normal behavioral thresholds." The Duke took another step. "And her?" Rellan's tone shifted slightly. "She is one of the last functioning stabilizers." A pause. Then, or she was. Midnight Rain suddenly lifted his head at that. Slowly. Like something remembering it had ears, Rellan noticed. "Ah!" he said softly. "There it is." The Duke turned slightly. "What?" Rellan pointed toward the horse, the anchor. Caldwell shook his head slowly, terrified. "No, don't say that word." But Rellan continued. "She didn't just stabilize him, she anchored him. That is why he obeyed her without command." The Duke's voice tightened. "Obeyed is not the word you used earlier." Rellan nodded. "Correct. Because this is not obedience." He stepped slightly closer. "This is dependency. Silence." That word changed everything again. Even the rain seemed to hesitate. Rellan continued. "The creature you call Midnight Rain is not a horse. It is a composite behavioral construct, built from multiple conditioning layers and identity suppression fields." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "And you expect me to believe that?" Rellan smiled faintly. "You already have evidence." Midnight Rain took one step forward, not toward Rellan, toward the Duke, slow, careful, almost uncertain. The Duke didn't move. The horse stopped in front of him, close enough that breath met breath. Rellan watched carefully. "Observe," he said softly. Midnight Rain lowered his head slightly, not in submission, not in aggression, in recognition. The Duke slowly raised a hand. Caldwell whispered in panic, "My Duke, don't touch it!" But the Duke did. His palm met the horse's forehead, and something flickered. A memory. Not his, not fully, but shared. For a brief moment he saw a white-lit room, chains that weren't physical, a girl standing between chaos and collapse, and a voice calling a name he did not know he had heard before, Kael. The Duke's hand tightened slightly. The vision vanished. He staggered half a step back. Rellen's voice came quietly. "Now you see." The Duke breathed slowly. "What did you just do to me?" Rellen shook his head. "I did nothing." She did. A pause. Then, "The anchor effect is unstable without proximity. That is why she was removed." The Duke's eyes sharpened instantly. "Because she refused you." Rellen didn't deny it. "That is one interpretation." The Duke's voice dropped. "Where is she?" Rellen's exhaled. "A containment vessel en route to the Central Reclamation Facility." The Duke nodded once. "Take me there." Rellen actually smiled this time. "That is not possible." The Duke stepped forward. "Try me." A long pause, then Rellen lifted his wrist device again, but before he could activate it, Midnight Rain moved. Fast. Too fast. The horse slammed its body between the Duke and Rellen. The impact cracked the stone beneath them. Caldwell shouted in shock. Rellen stepped back immediately. "Interesting," he whispered again. The Duke looked at the horse, and then realized something. It wasn't protecting him, it was choosing alignment. Rellen's voice turned colder. "So the anchor persists even after separation." He looked at the Duke. "And now you are part of it." The Duke frowned. "I don't understand what you're saying." Rellen raised his hand higher. "You will." The air began to distort again, but weaker than before, because Midnight Rain was resisting it. The horse's body trembled, glowing faintly again beneath its coat. And then, it did something no one expected. It knelt, not to Rellen, not to the field, to the Duke. Caldwell froze. The Duke himself went still. Rellen stared. That is not programmed behaviour. Midnight Rain's head lowered fully, and then a voice formed, not sound, not spoken language. But inside the Duke's mind, she is the key. The Duke's eyes widened slightly. Rellen noticed immediately. He said softly. "Telepathic bleed-through." The Duke looked at him sharply. "What is happening to me?" Rellen's tone turned clinical. "The anchor is transferring." A pause. "Then, which means she is no longer the only one who can stabilize him." The Duke's expression darkened. "What are you suggesting?" Rellen smiled faintly. "I am suggesting you are becoming replaceable." The words hit, but before they could settle, Midnight Rain rose suddenly, and the courtyard lights shattered again. But this time, instead of darkness, a path appeared, a thin distortion in space itself, pointing outward toward the world beyond Blackthorne. Rellen stepped back slightly. "Impossible," he whispered. Caldwell stared at it. "A breach route." The Duke looked at it, and understood. It wasn't escape, it was direction. Midnight Rain turned its head toward the Duke again, and the voice returned in his mind. "She is not far." The Duke exhaled slowly, then looked at Rellen. "I'm leaving," Rellen frowned. "You cannot traverse a forming breach without authorization." The Duke stepped toward the distortion anyway. "I am not asking." Caldwell stood up quickly. "My Duke, if you go through that, you may not return as you are." The Duke paused slightly, then replied, "I already won't," and he stepped into the breach. Midnight Rain followed immediately. Caldwell hesitated, then cursed under his breath and ran after them. Rellen watched them disappear, then slowly lowered his wrist device. For the first time, he looked unsettled. "This was not the intended outcome," he murmured. Behind him, one of the operatives asked, "Overseer?" Rellen stared at the fading breach. "We may have just reactivated the original Whisperer sequence," he said quietly, and far away. Inside a moving black containment carriage, Evelyn opened her eyes again, and smiled faintly, because she felt it, the fracture, the opening, and something else. Midnight Rain wasn't gone. He was coming. The black containment carriage moved without wheels. It did not roll, it shifted, as if reality itself was being persuaded to carry it forward. Inside, Evelyn sat with her hands bound by thin silver restraints that pulsed faintly with each of her heartbeats. Not to restrict movement, but to dampen resonance, to keep whatever she was from singing into the world again. Outside the carriage walls, the storm no longer behaved like weather. It behaved like pursuit. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment and listened. Not with ears, with whatever part of her had once been trained to hear instability in living systems. And she felt it immediately, a fracture, small, sharp, familiar. Her lips parted slightly. "Kael," she whispered. The carriage jolted, not physically, structurally. The metal groaned as if the word had weight. A voice responded from the front of the carriage, calm, controlled. Do not attempt resonance activation, Overseer Relin warned. You are already exceeding containment thresholds. Evelyn opened her eyes slowly. You're afraid, she said softly. A pause. Then Relin replied, I am precise. Evelyn leaned back slightly. No, she said. You're afraid of what he becomes when I am not there. Silence. That silence was enough confirmation. The carriage continued forward, slicing through a corridor of distorted air. Outside, shapes moved in the storm. Figures that were not fully formed, like echoes of something trying to become real. Evelyn felt them, but she did not react. Because her attention was elsewhere now. Faint, distant, but growing. Midnight rain. No, not midnight rain, Kael. And something else. Something heavier. Something resisting the world itself. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. You brought him, she whispered. Her wrist tightened involuntarily against the restraints. The carriage responded instantly, its systems adjusting pressure. Relin's voice sharpened. Do not provoke the anchor link. Evelyn tilted her head. Anchor link? She repeated quietly, a pause. Then she smiled faintly. You still think I am anchoring him? Her eyes lowered. That's not what I did. The carriage slowed. Relin's tone changed. Explain. Evelyn looked out into the shifting storm beyond the glass. And for the first time she spoke like someone remembering something she was never supposed to forget. I didn't anchor him, she said softly. I stabilized what they built inside him. A beat. Then, but he anchored me first. The carriage went silent. Even its movement stuttered slightly. Relin's voice came lower now. That is not in the records. Evelyn gave a small, tired exhale. Of course it isn't. The restraints pulsed again, but she didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes sharpened. Because you only recorded what you could control. A distant tremor rolled through the air. The carriage reacted instantly, locking systems tightening. Relin spoke quickly. Containment integrity increasing. Evelyn, cease emotional escalation. But she wasn't listening anymore. Because now, she felt him closer. Not physically, not yet. But structurally, like the world ahead had started bending toward a single point. Evelyn whispered. You're learning how to come back. A faint smile touched her lips. But you don't know who you are anymore, do you? Outside the containment route, the breach tore open wider. Midnight rain stepped through first. But something was different now. The horse's form flickered between two states, animal and something far more defined. Beneath the surface of its body, faint lines of light pulsed like circuits trying to remember they were not flesh. Behind him, the Duke emerged next. He staggered slightly as reality reassembled itself around him. Cold air, open land, a sky fractured with unstable storm remnants. Caldwell fell to his knees immediately, gasping. My Duke, this place is not mapped. The Duke didn't respond. He was staring at his hand, still faintly trembling. Because the memory from the horse hadn't left. It had settled, not as vision, as knowledge that didn't belong to him. Midnight rain turned his head slowly, and the voice returned inside the Duke's mind, forward. The Duke frowned slightly. Where? The horse's gaze shifted toward the horizon, and then a faint distortion pulsed in the distance. Like a wound in the sky. Caldwell noticed it too. His voice dropped. That's a transit corridor. The Duke looked at him. You understand this? Caldwell hesitated. I understand enough to know we should not be able to see it. Midnight rain took a step forward, then another. The Duke followed instinctively. Caldwell scrambled up quickly. My Duke, if that leads to a reclamation facility, we are walking into their territory, the Duke replied without turning. They already took something from me. A pause. Then colder. I am returning the favour. Inside the containment carriage, the distortion in Evelyn's perception suddenly shifted. Her head lifted sharply. Relin noticed immediately. What did you do? Evelyn blinked once, then slowly smiled. Oh, she whispered. He found the corridor. Relin's expression tightened. That is not possible without synchronization clearance. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. You still don't understand, do you? Her voice softened. He doesn't need clearance anymore. A beat. Then she added, because he remembers the path I gave him. The carriage jolted violently. Relin's voice snapped. Increased suppression fields. Now, but Evelyn was already leaning forward slightly. Not struggling, not resisting, just listening. Because now the connection was no longer one-sided. It was active, and growing unstable. Her eyes softened. Kael, she whispered again, and somewhere far away, Midnight Rain stopped walking. The Duke felt it instantly. The air shifted. The corridor ahead bent slightly, not away from them, toward them. Caldwell whispered in horror. My Duke, it's responding to her voice. The Duke's jaw tightened, then we moved faster, but Midnight Rain didn't move. It stood perfectly still. And then, for the second time since everything began, it spoke inside the Duke's mind, but this time clearer, stronger, not fragmented. She is calling from inside containment. The Duke's eyes narrowed. How do I reach her? A pause, then the answer. Break the vessel. Caldwell went pale instantly. No, that means, but the Duke was already moving forward. What vessel? Midnight Rain turned its head toward the sky, and the storm above them split open. For just a second, a silhouette appeared. A moving black structure cutting through the fracture in reality. The Duke saw it. Caldwell saw it. Even Midnight Rain reacted. The horse's body tensed, and the voice returned again. There. The Duke exhaled slowly, then said, Good. A pause, then colder, then we go through it. Caldwell grabbed his arm immediately. My Duke, if you enter that containment structure externally, they will erase you before you reach her. The Duke looked at him, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his expression. I am not reaching her, he said quietly. A beat. I am retrieving what they stole, and Midnight Rain lowered its head slightly, as if approving then. It ran, straight toward the fracture in the sky. The Duke followed immediately. Caldwell screamed behind them, forced to run or be left behind. Above them, the storm split wider. Inside it, the containment carriage continued forward, and Evelyn closed her eyes, because she felt it too now, not approaching, not chasing, not following, but arriving. Her lips parted slightly. Kael, she whispered, and this time, the response came from both sides of reality, I remember. The carriage alarms erupted instantly. Rellan shouted, Full lockdown! He's breaching synchronization barrier. Evelyn opened her eyes, and smiled faintly. Good, she whispered. Then you're finally waking up. Outside, the fracture in the sky tore open completely, and the Duke of Blackthorne stepped into war with a system that had never expected him to learn its language. The fracture in the sky did not open like a door. It opened like a wound that refused to close. Midnight Rain, Kael was the first to enter. The Duke followed without hesitation. Caldwell hesitated only a heartbeat longer, then cursed under his breath, and ran after them, swallowed by the tearing seam of reality. For a moment there was nothing. No wind, no ground, no sky. Only motion through something that felt like being unmade and rewritten at the same time. Then they emerged. A vast structure suspended in an impossible void. Black glass. Floating corridors. Veins of light running through it like a living nervous system. The reclamation vessel. Evelyn's prison. The Duke landed hard on a metallic surface that hummed beneath his boots like it was aware of him. Caldwell staggered beside him, breathless. My Duke, he whispered. We are inside it. Kael stood ahead of them, perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, listening, not to sound, to her, and then the voice returned inside the Duke's mind. She is close. The Duke straightened slowly. Lead. Kael moved, not running, not rushing, but absolute certainty in motion. The corridors of the vessel reacted to their presence instantly. Walls shifted. Doors sealed. Security systems awakened like sleeping predators. And then the voice of Overseer Rellan echoed through the structure. Oakline breach detected. Containment failure escalating. Subject Evelyn Ashbourne is to remain secured at all costs. The Duke didn't slow down. Neither did Kael. Caldwell whispered shakily. They are mobilizing internal suppression units. And as if summoned by the words, figures appeared ahead, tall, armoured, not guards, correctors. They moved as one. And the corridor itself tightened around them. Pressure increased. Air thickened. Reality resisting intrusion. Kael stopped. The Duke stopped beside it. The correctors raised their hands. And the world began to compress. The Duke's body trembled slightly. He didn't use this time. He stepped forward instead. One step, then another. Caldwell shouted, My Duke, don't! But Kael moved first. A single step forward, and the suppression field shattered, not resisted, broken. Like something inside the system finally recognizing it had been built incorrectly. The correctors froze. For the first time, uncertainty entered their formation, and Kael spoke. Not in words, but in resonance. A wave passed through the corridor, and every light in the structure flickered violently. The Duke felt it, the system hesitating, then failing. The corridor ahead opened, unsealed. Inviting. Caldwell stared in disbelief. There, yielding. The Duke didn't answer, because he felt it too. Not surrender, recognition. The system was no longer sure what Kael was, or what had been awakened inside it. They moved forward, corridors bending, shifting, unlocking as they passed, until finally they reached a vast chamber, a circular core suspended over nothing, and inside it a single containment platform, black glass, silver restraints, and Evelyn. She stood at its centre, head slightly lowered, but the moment the Duke saw her, she lifted her eyes. and everything stopped. Not systems, not alarms, not machinery. Even Kael froze. Evelyn smiled faintly, not weakly, not sadly, recognizing something only she could see. "You came," she whispered. The Duke stepped forward immediately. "I said I would." Rellen's voice erupted through the chamber. "You were not authorized to reach this level." The ceiling fractured open. Overseer Rellen descended with multiple operatives behind him. But he did not look at the Duke first. He looked at Kael, and for the first time his composure cracked. "The stabilization's bond is complete," he murmured. Evelyn turned slightly toward him. "No," she said softly. Rellen frowned. "No." Evelyn looked back at Kael, and then at the Duke, and finally said, "It was never one bond." A pause. Then she added, "It was always three." The Duke didn't understand, but Kael did, its body lowered slightly, not in submission, in alignment. Rellen's voice sharpened. "Terminate containment sequence immediately." The structure began to collapse inward. Lights dimmed. The chamber began compressing, but Evelyn didn't move. Neither did the Duke, because Kael stepped forward again, and this time it did not resist the system, it rewrote it. The chamber froze, mid-collapse, mid-destruction, mid-command. Everything suspended. Rellen's eyes widened. Impossible. Evelyn stepped down from the platform. The restraints fell apart as she walked. She approached the Duke, slowly, and stopped just in front of him. For a moment neither spoke. Then she said softly, "You were never supposed to come here." The Duke replied, "You were never supposed to be taken." Silence. Then Evelyn looked past him at Kael and said quietly, "You remember now, don't you?" Kael lowered it, and this time it spoke aloud, not inside minds, but into reality itself. Yes, the chamber trembled. Rellen stepped back. No, that sequence was erased." Evelyn turned slightly. "You didn't erase it," she said. "You split it." A pause. Then, "And now it's whole again." The Duke finally understood, not fully, but enough. "What is he?" he asked quietly. Evelyn looked at Kael, then at him, and answered, "He is what remains when control fails to understand love." Silence fell. Rellen raised his hand in desperation. "Terminate all three subjects." The system responded. But nothing obeyed. The chamber no longer recognized him. The vessel no longer accepted command, because Kael had already rewritten the structure, and Evelyn had already stabilized what mattered. Rellen whispered, "What have you done?" Evelyn looked at him calmly. "I finished what you started." The chamber began to dissolve around them, not violently, but releasing, unbinding. Freedom spreading through corrupted architecture. Rellen's form flickered as systems rejected his authority. "You cannot undo containment," he said sharply. Evelyn shook her head. "I already did." The Duke turned slightly. "Where will it go now?" Evelyn looked at Kael, and Kael looked at her, and for the first time it was peaceful. "I don't control him," she said softly. A pause. Then, "He chooses now." Kael stepped forward toward the system, not toward Rellen, but toward Evelyn, and lowered its head gently against her shoulder. A gesture not of obedience, but of reunion. The chamber finally collapsed fully. Light-consuming structure, rewriting it into nothing, and when the world stabilized again, they were no longer inside the vessel. They stood in open air, under a calm sky that no longer stormed. Caldwell collapsed to his knees, laughing in disbelief. Rellen was gone. Not destroyed, removed. Evelyn exhaled softly. The Duke looked at her. "You're free now," he said quietly. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I always was." A pause. Then she added, "I was just waiting for someone stubborn enough to believe it." The Duke almost smiled. Kael stood beside them, calm now, whole, not a horse, not a weapon, not a system, just Kael. Evelyn looked at both of them, and said softly, "What now?" The Duke looked at the horizon, at the open world, at everything that had changed, and replied, "Now we make sure no one builds cages like that again." Kael lowered its head once, in agreement, and for the first time since the storm began, there was no pursuit, only continuation, of something finally unbroken. The calm did not last, because calm was never something built to survive what they had become. It lasted only long enough for the world to decide whether it would accept them or reject them again. Evelyn stood in the open air, the remnants of the broken reclamation vessel dissolving behind them like smoke being forgotten. Kael, once midnight rain, remained beside her, no longer the flickering between states, no longer torn between identities, whole. The Duke watched both of them carefully, as if waiting for the next system to activate, the next chain to snap shut around reality. But nothing came. Caldwell finally rose from his knees, still shaken. "My Duke," he said quietly, "if that facility is gone, then the order will." He stopped himself, because even he didn't know what will meant anymore. The Duke finished it for him. "Adapt," he said. A pause. Then colder, "and come again." Evelyn turned slightly toward him. They will, she said softly. They always do. Kael shifted beside her, not alert, not defensive, just aware. The Duke exhaled slowly. Then we prepare. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Not studying him anymore, not testing him, just seeing him. Then she asked, "Why did you follow me?" The question hung in the air differently now. No suppression field. No collapsing system. Just truth. The Duke didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer felt too simple for everything that had happened. So he gave it anyway. "Because something in my world bent the moment you looked at my horse," he said quietly, "and I refused to accept that I would never understand why." Caldwell looked away, as if embarrassed by the honesty. Evelyn's expression softened slightly. "That's not the reason you came all this way," she said. The Duke met her gaze. "No," he admitted, "it isn't." A pause. Then, more quietly, "I came because, when you were taken, it felt like something in me was unfinished." Silence. Even Kael lowered its head slightly at that. Evelyn nodded once, slowly. "I know," she said. The wind moved gently through the open space around them, carrying nothing hostile now. No pursuit, no fracture, just distance. Kael stepped forward once, then stopped. It looked at Evelyn, not waiting for command, not seeking direction, just asking. Evelyn reached out and placed her hand lightly against its forehead. There was no glow this time, no distortion. Only recognition. "You don't belong to them anymore," she whispered. Kael closed its eyes, and for the first time it did not respond with power, only stillness. The Duke watched this quietly, then asked, "And what about you?" Evelyn turned toward him. The question was not unfamiliar, but the answer had changed. She looked at the horizon, at the broken remnants of a world that had tried to define her. Then she said, "I don't belong to them either." A pause. Then she added, "And I never belonged in cages disguised as service." Caldwell exhaled slowly. The Duke nodded once. "I agree," that was all he said. But it was enough. A long silence followed. Not empty. Just fine. Then Evelyn spoke again. "Where do we go now?" Kael lifted its head slightly. The Duke looked at both of them. And for the first time since Blackthorne Hall, since storms and fractures and systems and names, he didn't think in terms of control, or ownership, or containment. He thought in terms of direction and possibility, so he said, "Forward." Evelyn gave a faint, almost relieved smile. Kael stepped beside her, and together they began walking, not away from anything, but into what came next. Caldwell followed after a moment, muttering under his breath, "This is going to ruin every record I've ever written." The Duke heard him, and almost smiled. Behind them, the sky remained calm. But far beyond it, unseen and unspoken, systems that had once governed their lives began to quietly rewrite themselves in response to a simple truth. Some bonds are not engineered, some names are not assigned, and some cages, once broken, do not return, they simply stop existing. And in the world that remained, a maid who was never just a maid, a duke who refused to be controlled, and a horse that remembered its name, walked forward, not as legend, not as anomaly, but as something far more dangerous to any system that might come after them. Free. There was no dramatic final collapse of the world, no thunderclap of endings, no divine seal closing behind them. Just distance. The kind that grows when something that once defined you is no longer allowed to. They had been walking for hours, across land that no longer appeared on any map Caldwell recognised. Even he had stopped asking questions now. That was new. The Duke noticed it. He noticed everything. Kael walked slightly ahead, its steps steady, no longer burdened by instability or fragmented identity. It did not look back often, but when it did, it always checked the same thing. Evelyn. Always Evelyn. Evelyn walked beside the Duke sometimes, and sometimes just ahead of him, never fully matching pace with anyone, as if she was still learning what it meant to exist without containment. The sky above them was unfamiliar, not storming, not clear, just undecided. Caldwell finally broke the silence. "My Duke," he said carefully, "we are being followed." The Duke didn't slow. "I know." Caldwell frowned. "You know?" The Duke glanced sideways. "I've known for the last 3 hours." Kael's ear flicked slightly. Evelyn stopped walking. So did the Duke. A few seconds passed. Then Evelyn asked softly, "Why didn't you say anything?" The Duke looked forward. "Because they are not close enough to matter yet." A pause. Then he added, "And because I wanted to see if you would notice first." Caldwell exhaled sharply. "That is not reassuring." Kael turned fully now. Its presence shifted slightly, less animal, more awareness. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. "They're not order," she said quietly. The Duke nodded once. "No," Caldwell's voice dropped. "Then what are they?" The wind shifted, and for the first time since the journey began, something other than silence answered. Footsteps. Not behind them. Ahead. emerging from the horizon like they had always been waiting there. Figures, not armoured like Relland's operatives, not uniform, worn, human, and yet not ordinary. There were 5 of them. The one in front carried a staff carved with old markings that Evelyn's expression immediately tightened at. Kael stopped moving completely. Evelyn whispered, "No." The Duke looked at her. "You recognise them." Evelyn didn't answer immediately, because recognition was not simple. It came with weight, with memory, with consequence. The man with the staff stepped forward. His voice was calm, but not kind. "Evelyn Ashbourne," he said, "you were not meant to leave containment." Caldwell immediately moved behind the Duke. The Duke didn't react outwardly, but something in his posture shifted. Evelyn finally spoke. "I was never meant to be contained at all." The man tilted his head slightly. "And yet you were corrected." Kael took one slow step forward. The air around it tightened slightly. The man's gaze shifted to the Duke. "And you are an unexpected variable," the Duke replied evenly. "I get that a lot." A faint pause. Then the man spoke again. "You have disrupted the balance between systems." Evelyn's voice sharpened. There was no balance. There was control. The man didn't react. Instead, he tapped his staff once on the ground. And the world around them shifted slightly, not visually, structurally, like reality had been nudged into a different alignment. Caldwell staggered. "What is that?" he whispered. Kael lowered its head slightly. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. The Duke stepped forward half a pace. The man spoke. "We are not the Order. We are what preceded it. Silence." That landed differently. Even Caldwell stopped breathing for a second. Evelyn's voice dropped. "The Keepers." The man nodded once. "Correct." Kael exhaled sharply through its nose, an almost human reaction. The Duke looked at Evelyn. "What does that mean?" Evelyn didn't take her eyes off them. "It means," she said slowly, "they were the ones who decided what should never be free." The man raised his staff slightly. "And you broke a boundary that was never meant to be touched." A pause. Then, "You have restored something that was sealed for a reason." Kael stepped forward again. Evelyn placed a hand gently on its shoulder. "No," she said softly. "We restored someone." The Keeper's gaze narrowed slightly. "That distinction will not save you." The Duke's voice turned colder. "It might not need to." A faint silence. Then the Keeper lifted his staff fully, and the ground beneath them began to split. Not violently, but precisely as if our reality itself was being measured for correction. Caldwell shouted, "My Duke, this is higher authority than the Order. This is foundational structure." The Duke looked at him briefly. "Then we deal with it the same way we dealt with the Order." Caldwell's eyes widened. "That is not comparable," the Duke replied calmly. "It is if they both believe she belongs in a cage." Evelyn looked at him then, properly, fully. Something in her expression softened, but only slightly. Kael stepped forward again, and then it spoke. "Not into minds, not into systems, but into the air itself. No more cages." The ground froze. The Keepers paused. Even their staff stopped mid-motion. The man's expression changed for the first time. "That is not possible," he whispered. Evelyn looked at Kael, then at the Duke, and finally at the horizon behind them, and she said quietly, "Then we change what is possible." A pause. Then she stepped forward. The Duke followed. Kael followed. Caldwell hesitated. Then, under his breath, "I am going to regret this," he muttered, and followed too. The Keepers did not move immediately. They watched, as if witnessing something that had been erased too many times to believe it had returned, and then the man lowered his staff slightly. "So it has begun again," he said quietly, not to them, but to something beyond them, something older, something deeper, and far away, in places no one could see anymore. Systems that had once governed obedience, containment, and correction began to quietly reactivate. But this time, they were not alone in the story, because something had already changed the rules. A girl who was never meant to be free, a horse that remembered its name, a duke who refused to accept silence as order, and a world that would now have to decide whether it could survive without cages at all. They walked forward, and for the first time, the path did not close behind them. It simply continued. End.